I sat in a panel in the audience listening to a discussion about access to trans healthcare and, what sort of roadblocks, obstacles, and things like that existed even as trans insurance started to become sort of more accessible. And so access to care is different than access to coverage because while you may have trans-inclusive insurance benefits, getting access to a surgeon can still be somewhat difficult, particularly now as doctors' waiting lists continue to grow. So I think Bowers has like a 2-year waiting list now. McGinn is still at like 6 to 8 months, and some of these other doctors have equally long waiting lists. So even if you have coverage, getting the care is not necessarily easy and will become more challenging as more people get coverage. So I thought this was going to be a really interesting discussion, something that I'm sort of very interested in, and unfortunately we didn't get really deep into the access part of the conversation because a couple of cis allies wanted to show sort of how great of an ally they were by derailing the conversation. And so for context, there was a doctor sitting on the panel, one of the speakers, who works for one of these major insurance providers. It happened to be Aetna, and was actually discussing how Aetna is going to roll out trans-inclusive benefits in all of their plans, and that they have to go through sort of the bureaucratic process with each individual state. So it's going to take them a few years to do it, but so be on the lookout for that, because those plans will also be available on the market. And so this is a guy who you figure, okay, this is a pretty good ally because Aetna is the first insurance carrier to take this step, and hopefully the other carriers will follow. But then he was getting beat up by one of the audience members for referring to gender dysphoria as gender identity disorder, which, I understand the difference between the two terms, and obviously gender dysphoria is preferable, but that wasn't a point that really needed to be addressed, and sort of addressed so, sort of vehemently at that moment, because it derailed us from the conversation, because the person in the audience went on to accuse the doctor of not necessarily knowing what they're talking about, and sort of getting very emotional about it. And to be fair, that person has a trans child and has encountered plenty of obstacles with insurance companies, so I can totally understand where she was coming from, but that's something I think didn't need to happen right then and there. Likewise, there was another person in the audience who started attacking the doctor because they said, well, even if a trans person wants to get access to a wide variety of services, so going beyond surgery, sort of top and bottom surgery, sort of the standards maybe, but including things like facial feminization surgery, electrolysis, all sorts of things like that. And the doctor's point, which is something that I completely understand, is sort of where do you draw the line with coverage from a realistic, sort of pragmatic point of view. So in an ideal world, an insurance company covers every single medical condition, all the various treatments, things like that. But unfortunately, that's not really always possible, because of sort of different reasons. An employer has to control their costs if they're fully funded, so does the government as a sort of a funding party, and if it's full insurance, which means that the insurance company pays for all of the care it approves through its own revenue streams, which is basically your premiums, then they have to draw the line somewhere, otherwise they'll go out of business. And so these are sort of realistic things to think about. So trans people will sometimes argue they should be able to see any surgeon that they want. But there are a lot of people with a lot of different medical conditions who don't get that kind of choice because, while we would all love to go to the Mayo Clinic or Cedars-Sinai, not every plan can afford to do that for every single patient. Likewise, while I think electrolysis would be a great benefit to be included. Are you going to include electrolysis for anybody with any sort of condition like PCOS or anything else that causes hair growth as well? And so if you do that for trans people, sort of where are you drawing the line on who gets sort of what level or what depth of coverage? And it's not necessarily a pleasant conversation to have. I can't imagine that they're easy conversations to have, easy decisions to make, given that you have these sort of constraints of we don't want to increase premiums too high, but at the same time we want to cover as much as possible for as many people as possible, and that's sort of something I can appreciate and recognize. And I think that sort of saying, well, you don't cover it for trans people because you're cheap is really not the full story, because they don't cover it for trans people because then what else are they going to cover for other people? And you can't have every doctor sort of, I don't know, like, that's sort of the point is, where do they draw the line? And unfortunately, it's still a line that needs to be drawn right now. And that doesn't mean that that line can't move, because it could, it should, and it will, to include more people, to be more holistic. But we have to sort of be patient with the process. And this is, a company that is going out and taking the first move to be more inclusive. So that's a good ally, and I don't think we have to sit there and beat them up simply because we may disagree with some things that whatever, like, I don't know, like, it's ridiculous. So then at the end, the doctor did admit that gender identity disorder was no longer the correct term, that it was gender dysphoria. He apologized to anyone in the audience he may have offended, which was, very sort of great of him to do that. But at the same time, it's like he had to do that instead of talking about access to care, maybe what we can start to do to train more doctors, to get them to be more competent on trans-related care, to get them more qualified to perform trans-related surgery and things like that. And instead, we're sitting there listening to how great of allies these people are.